Right. Let's dive straight into this explainer, where we're going to act as forensic investigators. Our goal? To uncover exactly how a 1929 Wall Street crash managed to infect the entire globe. We aren't just going to sit here and look at dry charts. We're really going to dig into the hard data, the deeply divided economic theories, and honestly, the sheer human reality of one of the most devastating financial disasters in modern history.
To crack this massive historical mystery, we're going to follow 5 clear stages. First, the 1929 market crash. Second, a global economic contagion. Third, we'll weigh competing economic theories. Fourth, life during the Depression. And finally, the road to recovery.
So, Section 1, the 1929 market crash, the inciting incident.
Our autopsy kicks off in the fall of 1929. Picture this. It's the very tail end of the Roaring '20s. This was an era of tremendous wealth and booming industry, but so much of that profit was just poured right back into wild stock market speculation. It was heavily fueled by loose lending and practically zero regulation. Well, that speculative boom finally hit its breaking point. Just look at how this boom turns into absolute, utter panic over just a few devastating days in late October. On October 24th, a day that goes down in history as Black Thursday, the American stock market dropped 11% right at the opening bell. I mean, imagine the sheer chaos on that trading floor. Despite some frantic attempts by major bankers to patch things up, the bottom completely fell out just a weekend later. On Black Monday, the market dropped another 12%. And then the panic peaked the very next day on Black Tuesday, with another crushing 11% crash. Billions of dollars literally vanished into thin air, and many stocks simply couldn't be sold at any price no matter how desperate the seller was.
85%. The sheer scale of this wipeout is almost difficult to wrap your head around. Between September 1929 and July 1932, the market lost 85% of its total value. The Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted from a soaring high of 381 all the way down to a catastrophic low of just 41. You have to understand, this wasn't just a market correction or, a bad quarter. It was a total foundational loss of confidence in the entire financial system. Fortunes that took lifetimes to build were completely erased in a matter of months.
Moving on to Section 2, a global economic contagion, how the crisis spread.
Now, you might be wondering, how does a localized stock market crash in New York inherently mean immediate global poverty? Well, the decline in the U.S. economy triggered a sudden drop in trade, capital movement, and general business confidence that very quickly crossed oceans. We have to look at the true pathology of how this became a worldwide contagion. If we look at the data between 1929 and 1932, we see these horrifying spikes in unemployment and plummeting production across the world's major economies. The United States saw unemployment jump by over 600%. But look at the contrast over in Europe. The UK saw a really painful 129% increase in unemployment, but Germany? Germany depended heavily on U.S. loans to prop up its post-war economy, and they were utterly devastated. They saw a massive 232% spike in unemployment and a 41% drop in industrial production. And as you might guess, this severe economic desperation in Germany would ultimately fuel political extremism and really help pave the way for the rise of the Nazi Party. So how exactly did a New York crash sink Europe? The answer, primarily, is the gold standard. Think of the gold standard as the main transmission mechanism. It essentially chained all these independent nations together on a sinking ship. Under this monetary system, any country that wanted to keep its currency pegged to gold had to allow its domestic money supply to decrease and its domestic prices to decline whenever gold reserves left the country. Higher interest rates in one country led to gold flowing out of others, which forced everyone tied to the standard to adopt the exact same painful deflationary policies. It completely starved their economies of much-needed cash. And to make matters infinitely worse, desperate governments tried to quarantine their economies using massive tariffs. The logic seemed simple, but it was deeply flawed. Protect domestic jobs by keeping foreign goods out. For example, the U.S. Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in 1930 to shield American industry. But this just sparked immediate retaliatory tariffs worldwide. The very policies that were meant to save individual countries ended up dooming everyone by basically freezing the global economy. By 1933, this relentless protectionism had choked world trade down to just 1/3 of what it had been a mere 4 years earlier. It's just wild.
Which brings us to Section 3, competing economic theories, the forensic investigation.
Okay, let's hit pause on our timeline for a second and impartially review the competing forensic reports from top economic minds to understand exactly whose fault this was. As we dig into the source material, economists are completely split on the answer to one massive question. What turned a standard recession into a decade-long Great Depression? The initial 1929 crash definitely explains the spark, but it really doesn't account for the unprecedented severity and the sheer longevity of the crisis that followed.
So let's neutrally compare the two heavyweights of economic theory here. On one side, we've got the monetarists. Economists like Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz argue the central banks are squarely to blame. They point out that the Federal Reserve just passively watched a 35% contraction of the money supply, failing to act as a lender of last resort when panic caused massive bank runs. They literally just let the money vanish. Conversely, we have the Keynesian view. British economist John Maynard Keynes argued that a massive loss of confidence led to a sudden, devastating drop in consumption and aggregate demand. People stopped spending, so businesses stopped investing. The economy then just got stuck in this brutal, stagnant trap of high unemployment, a trap that Keynes argued could only be fixed by massive government spending to jumpstart demand.
Adding a really surprising touch of candor to that monetarist theory, former Federal Reserve Chairman Ben Bernanke actually admitted to Milton Friedman years later that the Fed was to blame. He famously said, "Regarding the Great Depression, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you, we won't do it again." By failing to provide emergency lending to key institutions, like the Bank of United States, which collapsed in 1930 and took $550 million in deposits down with it, the Federal Reserve essentially allowed widespread panic to spread totally unchecked. That wiped out a staggering 1/3 of all banks in the country.
Meanwhile, economist Irving Fisher provided this terrifying blueprint showing exactly how debts and falling prices created a vicious, self-aggravating doom loop. Fisher noted that in step 1, debt liquidation happens as people frantically try to pay off loans. But this leads directly to step 2, a fall in asset prices, because suddenly everyone is distress selling at the exact same time. This massive drop in prices means incomes plummet, leading straight to step 3, widespread bankruptcies. Outstanding debts remain at the exact same dollar amount, even though prices and incomes have fallen by up to 50%. Paradoxically, the more debtors paid off, the heavier their true debt burden became. Finally, this triggers step 4, the hoarding of money. Panicked citizens pull cash from banks and literally stuff it in mattresses, further shrinking the money supply and feeding right back into step 1.
But we absolutely have to consider a third perspective, the heterodox Austrian school. This view argues that the Roaring '20s were fueled by artificial credit, making the catastrophic bust totally unavoidable right from the start. Economists like Friedrich Hayek and Murray Rothbard theorize that the Federal Reserve's massive expansion of the money supply in the 1920s created a completely unsustainable boom in asset prices and bad investments. By the time the Fed finally tightened up its policies in 1928, the Austrian view says the damage was already done. The foundation was completely rotten, and it was far too late to prevent the whole structure from coming down.
Let's shift gears to Section 4, Life During the Depression, the Human Toll.
Stepping away from the macroeconomic data and competing theories for a minute, we really need to ground this explainer in the microeconomic reality of the people actually trying to survive this era. Behind every single one of these statistics were real families facing unprecedented hardship. By 1933, the United States hit a staggering 25% unemployment rate. With 9,000 banks completely wiped out and life savings evaporated, families had to get incredibly resourceful. About 1/3 of all farmers lost their land. In cities reliant on heavy industry, construction virtually halted, and with crop prices dropping up to 60%, the rural areas were equally devastated.
But the sheer ingenuity of households during this time was truly remarkable, particularly among women who were navigating extreme daily shortages. The updated survival strategies their mothers had used in earlier times of poverty. Women expanded vegetable gardens to basically every available patch of dirt, and famously began repurposing rough cotton feed sacks into dresses and clothing for their kids. Diets fundamentally changed too. Families turned to much cheaper, less desirable foods, even purchasing horse meat just to get some form of protein on the table. Communities also relied heavily on mutual aid. They traded with neighbors, took in boarders to share rent, and shared whatever spare resources they could scrounge up. The birth rate even fell significantly worldwide, because having children was just postponed until families could actually afford to feed them.
Finally, Section 5, the road to recovery, finding the cure. So how did the world finally cure this economic sickness and pull itself out of the abyss? In most countries, the recovery process kicked off around 1933, but let me tell you, it was a very long and uneven road. The data gives us one definitive takeaway. The quickest way to jumpstart recovery was to sever those golden chains.
Abandoning the rigid gold standard early proved to be a highly reliable predictor of a country's economic survival. The UK abandoned it in 1931 and suffered relatively less afterward. In stark contrast, the gold bloc nations like France and Belgium stubbornly stuck to the gold standard way longer and experienced deeply prolonged economic slumps as a result. Leaving the gold standard finally allowed central banks to untie their own hands, lower interest rates, and act as true lenders of last resort.
Furthermore, changing the actual psychology of the public was absolutely critical. Recovery relied heavily on regime changes, like Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal policies, which helped shift expectations away from endless, crushing deflation and toward a hopeful expansion. When FDR took office in 1933, his aggressive rollout of public works programs, bank holidays, and farm subsidies convinced the public to actually expect inflation and higher future incomes. This psychological shift was huge. It stimulated investment and demand. People believed things were going to get more expensive, so they started buying again. That pulled the U.S. economy off the absolute bottom, even though unemployment would remain stubbornly high for several more years.
Ultimately, though, it was the massive, unprecedented government-financed mobilization for World War II that absorbed the unemployed and officially ended the Depression's lingering grip. The common consensus among economic historians is that the outbreak of global war in 1939 stimulated a colossal wave of factory production. In the United States alone, wartime mobilization moved roughly 10 million people straight out of the civilian labor force and into the military or defense manufacturing. This titanic, coordinated effort doubled economic growth rates and rapidly drove the unemployment rate down below 10%, effectively closing the book on the deepest economic collapse of the 20th century.
Which leaves us with this final, massive question. As we study the mechanics of this century-old disaster, we have to ask ourselves if our deeply interconnected modern economy is truly immune to another massive economic contagion. We've seen exactly how panic can spread from a single stock exchange to paralyze the entire globe, and how top economists still debate the exact triggers to this day. The Great Depression serves as a profound warning about the fragility of global wealth, but also as a powerful testament to human resilience in the face of absolute collapse. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the systems that surround us.